right, first things first. Regular viewers will recognize that I've had a shaving experience. This is because I was in hospital 2 months ago. I had some surgery, and the thought of dealing with that and feet of beard was just too much. So I'll trim down. I'm going to keep it like this, at least through the end of the year, and then perhaps in 2024 I'll grow it back out again. But I think this makes me look younger. So the surgery was very successful. I talked a little bit about it right beforehand, and the underlying condition, NF2. So if you want to watch that video, particularly if you're interested how hearing loss and NF2 has impacted my abilities and my thoughts about music, check out that video. But what I'm going to talk about today is my recovery, which went very well. I was off work for a couple months. I just went back to work yesterday, which was Monday. But in my time off, I read a lot. I probably read as many books in the last 2 months as I had in the previous... Well, I could probably figure it out because I do keep track of the books I read. But I've got this stack of books behind me, wherever, over there, and I'm going to bring them one by one, not in the order that I read them, because I don't keep track. I don't stack them in the order that I read them. But I'll go through and just kind of talk about each of the books, why those books are the ones I read. Some of them because I knew they would provide comfort to me. Some of them because they appeared fortuitously. And then try to pull together some ideas about what kind of books I liked to read. Spoiler, or to give away the answer. I liked books where there was a voice behind it, and where that voice was a compassionate first-person voice. Seemed to be what I liked. I liked a lot of memoirs and a lot of essays. So let me just turn back and get a few. Okay, I've got the first half dozen or so, again, not in the order I read them. I'm currently reading this one, Creation Spirituality. This book takes 4 paths of creation spirituality: the via positiva, the via negativa, the via creativity, whatever that is, via creativa, and then via transformativa. I'm in the creative bit now, which is having understood salvation, having understood creation, having understood the word, the biblical word, in this as a creative force, not just within the universe, not just within ourselves, but as a confluence of our own spirituality and our own creativity. What is it to be a spiritually oriented artist within a Christ-centered reading? And that's a relatively new piece to my spiritual path. I've been very involved in Buddhism for 30 years. And in the last, since the New Year, since Christmas, I've started attending the local Methodist church. I grew up in the Methodist church, but really after high school, didn't include it in my life. But I found it enormously rewarding, even before the surgery and the health issues associated with it, to bring in Methodism in particular. Matthew Fox is not a Methodist, but the view of spirituality as a positive force rather than an ascetic or ascetic force, a disciplined force, but not a self-abnegation. Anyway, so I'm reading through that. Ian Marchant, One Fine Day. I ordered this book back in, whenever it first became available for pre-order, February or March, and it arrived while I was in the hospital. So when I came home, this was waiting for me. It is a beautiful book. It embodies what I realized I was looking for, which is a humane, compassionate voice speaking to me, telling a story, tying threads together. It is a serious book, meaning it is weighty and meaningful and profound. It is a beautiful book. It is beautifully written. It is beautifully organized. It is beautifully illustrated. I can't say enough about this book. I read this, and then I don't own everything that Ian has written. I don't have Dole Acre, and I don't have the one about the men and model villages. But I read this, and then I feel like I gave that book really short shrift. Just read it. Parallel Lines was the second book by Ian Marchant that I read. This is his journey into the romance of trains, the parallel lines that he talks about are the reality of trains, and then I'm looking for the right word. I'm going to say dreamlike, the romance of trains, the hobby of trains. This has inspired me, since I read it, to do a similar project here in Pittsburgh, where I have a map of the trolley routes that used to be everywhere in Pittsburgh, literally everywhere. And in the 50s and 60s, they were paved over. For the most part, there's still a trolley system that goes out south. But I have a map of the original trolley lines, and I've always thought it would be interesting to walk those routes, whatever roads they currently now map to, and use that as a structure for a series of essays. I also would, of course, like to just ride every Amtrak line. I'm working on a short story right now, which is a central part of the story is the loop from Pittsburgh to Chicago, across New York State to New York City, the Lakeshore Limited, and down from New York to D.C., and then there's a line back up to Pittsburgh. It's a very different type of train system. The distances are huge. The idea of branch lines doesn't really exist here. There's commuter lines, but these enormous distances covered by trains. This is going to take me an hour if I keep going like this, but that's okay. That's what I'm going to do. If it takes an hour, I have an hour. Volume 1 of Brian Boyd's Nabokov biography, Volume 1 being the Russian years. I said it Nabokov because the very first words of this biography are Vladimir Nabokov, which is how I've always said his name. Then there's a footnote pronounced Vladimir Nabokov. So I'll try to take the hint. I'm probably always going to say Nabokov. I'm probably always going to say Moog, even though I think it's Moog. Or is it the other way around? Is it the Moogs? I'm currently in the midst of reading Volume 2, The American Years. I am much more familiar with the American Nabokov. In fact, Ada, I plan to read. Because I knew it's a book I love. I first read this Ada. I first read it when I was, I think, 19, in college, when I was staying up there for one of the midterm breaks. So I was by myself, and I don't know what prompted me to pick this up. I didn't, at that point, know anything about Nabokov. I don't think I even knew about Lolita. Lolita was not the first Nabokov I read. Ada was. And at the time, I understood maybe a third of it, but I fell in love with it. Martin Amis, who you'll see show up in the list later, thinks that this is a bloated book that marks the beginning of the decline of Nabokov. I have to disagree with him there. I think that it's extraordinarily beautiful. There's a real love story here. It's a book about the texture of time. It's a book that creates the texture of time as you read it, separate from the narrative, separate from the philosophy that's implied by it. I've probably read this book once every 3 to 5 years since I was 19. My copy that I had from back then is stored off somewhere because when I pulled it out to read it, the first chunk of pages were missing. The binding had come loose. So it was a bit of a scramble to get a copy. Next book, The Trial of Socrates. I didn't like this book. I.F. Stone is a great journalist or opinion writer. This I found just not... I can't remember why I didn't like it. Martin Amis, Visiting Mrs. Nabokov. This is a collection of his journalism from the New Statesman and the Observer primarily, but, mostly during the 80s. Including an interview where he did meet Vera Nabokov, hence the title. But many of these are about other interviews with other writers, other cultural barometers. I had not read this collection. Prior to that, I'd read The Rub of Time, which is essays. I'd read Time's Arrow, which is a novel. And I was very aware of Martin Amis, referenced from Christopher Hitchens, but I hadn't read a lot of Amis. And of course, he died in the last month or so. So that prompted me to bring him in. But Martin Amis is one of those voices that, particularly in the memoirs, I read first the very recent one, The Inside Story, which I think he wrote in 2020, 2021. And then from that I bought the earlier memoir, Experience, which I think was written 15, 20 years ago, a while ago. And the voice of his memoirs, the voice of his autobiography is lovely. He uses the word uxorious a lot to refer to people that he kind of likes. He looks to describe people by their uxoriousness, and I think on one hand it means the openness of the loving relationship to a wife, but I think in general it means loving women and loving humanity in general, and that voice comes through in his memoirs. I haven't read London Field or the famous novels, but I may get to them. So actually we've hit the three main voices. Ian Marchant, we'll get to a few more of his, Martin Amis, a few more of his, and Nabokov. Ada. These are voices that provide comfort to me, but then also provided guidance and healing. Let me get a few more. Another Martin Amis, Experience. I just talked about this, so I can skip through it. Just a wonderful book, and written over the time period through which his father Kingsley Amis, gets sick and dies. But it begins with Martin's college years. It's very focused on his parents for a lot of the book. Camus, a romance. This book had been on my list for a long time, and I was curious what it would be like. It's a sort of a very personal, I don't say informal, but it's a very personal study of Camus' life. And I read this in the first week, so I might have been a bit hazy, but my sense is that Elizabeth Hawes, the author, has a copy of Camus' notebooks, private notebooks and journals that had been published just before she wrote this book, which is back in the late 80s maybe. And that prompted her to remember how as an undergraduate in the 60s she had been, she wrote a thesis on Camus. This prompted me to order the complete Camus in French, which is an ongoing survey of mine. Now, the Martin Amis book, this I think is his last Inside Story, a novel, very interesting. I read this book, so he starts off by saying the things you can never write about, politics, religion, and sex. And then he goes on, and after about 50 pages, it occurred to me that what he was just been writing about in a truly remarkable and wonderful way was sex and love. And he does it. He has such a voice. Laud in here about Saul Bellow, who I confess I've never read any of. About whom, from whom, of whom. I've never read anything that Saul Bellow wrote. And I kind of wish I had, because both Martin Amis and Hitch speak highly of him. I read this after I read the Amis books. I've read this several times. This book, I will credit with turning me on to really making me understand Philip Larkin, who is a poet that is he in here? Yeah, here he is. This is the complete poems. It's actually incorrect to have this in the pile because I read from the collected poems, but the collected poems are downstairs because I'm reading them. I read one or two a day. And I've been trying to memorize. So I memorized Sonny Prestatyn, and I memorized the poem Here. And then there's a bunch of other from the Whitsun Wedding collection that I want to memorize. I don't care for the organization of the complete poems. I don't care about the chronological order. And honestly, I don't care about the complete poems. I care about the High Windows and Whitsun Wedding. Another Martin Amis book, Koba the Dread. I've had this stumbled a little bit. I don't know how nuanced Martin Amis is about politics, particularly compared to Christopher Hitchens, to whom this book is addressed. The Wild Places, Robert MacFarlane. I've read this before. I picked it up to read again because I like essays about landscape and about people traveling through landscape. We'll get done. This won't be an hour. Coasting, Jonathan Raban. Same kind of book. Terrible thing to say, sorry, it's not the same kind of book at all. Except that it is a person traveling through England, observing the landscape, observing the country, and observing themselves. This is the last. We're going to get done. Ishiguri. In the beginning, the opening in Go. For nearly 20 years, I have wanted to learn how to play Go. I've sputtered every once in a while with studying, but you do need to study. And I just think if 20 years ago I had started studying Go, I would have a beautiful, nuanced sense of the game. And I would be able to play beautiful, nuanced games with the few friends of mine who play it. I think Go is a communication between two people. It's a sport, right? Or it's a game, it's a contest. But the way I would like to be able to play it is to enter into these shared dialogues at the Go board with a couple of my friends who play Go very well. When the lights go out, Andy Beckett talking about Britain in the 70s. I read this after reading A Hero for High Times by Ian Marchant. This book is magisterial. Again, I'd read it when it came out. History of the Counterculture in Britain. I read it and then I bought a copy and gave it to my daughter, who is in her early 20s and is American, didn't grow up in England, so probably wouldn't catch a lot of the references to the scene and the politics back then. Of course, I in the 70s I was in single digits, but I remember No Power and General Strikes. They are early memories. Beckett has a second volume that begins with the election of Margaret Thatcher. This book ends with the election of Margaret Thatcher. No, sorry. Not this book. The Beckett book does that. The Marchant book takes us through what it is to be creative, spiritual, and alive. And how our culture has tried to support or repress that urge. 11 Minutes Late, another railway book. Mathew, Engel, also attracted by the romance of trains. Don't mean to give it short shrift, but I read it very quickly after I'd read Parallel Lines. And then ending with, which means I was beginning with, a couple more by Ian Marchant. Something of the Night. I will confess this is perhaps my least favorite of his books. It doesn't connect to me as much as the other ones do, except that it fills in the biography of pieces of his life that are mentioned in Parallel Lines. No, sorry, Parallel Lines and this book, The Longest Crawl. And so in that sense, I felt like I read a lot more about Ian and his mind and his formation. It's a good book. It's just it didn't grab me. Parallel Lines. I had brain surgery. The Longest Crawl is the first Ian Marchant book I read, and after reading here, One Fine Day, it was the book I wanted to read, but I couldn't yet get upstairs, so I sent my wife up to my office here to try and find it, and she couldn't. But she could find all the other Ian Marchant books, so I read those. And then when this finally came, there's a scene in this book that I'm not going to do justice to, but it's sort of 2/3 of the way through. Ian is back in Lancaster and visiting a pub that he frequented when he lived there as a young person. His daughter is now there. It's a local pub, so he knows everybody there. And it ends with the door closing, and for this moment, everything is perfect. And it's a beautiful moment. If I'd prepared, I would have found it, and I would read it to you. I'll give myself a second here to see if I can find it. Nope. All right. So those are the books that I read. Those were the books I read, just falling on my dog. Not good. He's had a rough day today. If there are books that tick that box for you. Books that bring comfort. Drop them in the comments. Let me know. All right, it's great to be back behind the microphone, and I hope to get more videos done. So, like, subscribe, share, etc. They're going to be like this. This is the kind of video I like to make, just chatting to the camera. I might occasionally do a bigger project, but more of this. So, cheers.